Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay. Good evening. I'm Emily Mello, Director of Education and Public Programming here at MAM. It's my pleasure tonight to do a brief introduction to this panel because they have so much to talk about. This programming, as many of you heard last week, is part of the record, Contemporary Art and Vinyl. And this presentation of the exhibition and our extensive programming related to the exhibition is supported by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation as part of the Knight Arts Challenge. We also have received additional support by DJ La Spam, including our MAM Sound Bomb Bus. And if you're looking for the Sound Bomb Bus, there's 2 stops this weekend. Tomorrow night we'll be in Big Night in Little Haiti. And on Saturday from noon to midnight, we will be at Sweatstock at Sweat Records. We also want to thank support from JW Marriott Marquis, Ocean Drive Magazine, Red Bull, Scratch Academy, Smirnoff, Stanton, Winter Music Conference, The Workshop Collective, WPBT Channel 2, WVUM FM, and we really want to thank our record committee. This is a group of musicians, record store owners, music makers, musicians, music makers, who am I leaving out? Artists, designers, collectors, and this group of people really guided all of our programming, including the 3-part series, Miami Vinyl. This is part 2. Last week was moderated by Andrew Yeomanson, DJ La Spam, and focused on the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. Today we will continue that discussion with the 70s through the 90s, and on May 3rd, we will have our final in the 3-part series with the 90s to today, moderated by Lauren, or Lolo Reskin, as many of you know her as the owner of Sweat Records. And the 3-part series, the whole committee had a lot of input, but it's really due to our moderator tonight, Bruno del Granado, who really conceived of this program that would make vinyl and records and the programming very relevant to our Miami audience. So we really thank him for this wonderful idea. I'm just going to briefly mention those other committee members, particularly our panel DJ tonight, DJ Esther Park, as well as Jordan Binder, Mario Cater-Fresh, P. Scott Cunningham, Michael Genovese, Nicholas Lobo, Aramis Laurie, Daniel Maluski, Laura Quinlan, Lauren Reskin, Leighton Walsh, and Andrew Yeomanson. And now I'm going to hand it over to Bruno del Granado, who is president of RM Entertainment, and he will further introduce or get to know our panelists, who I'll just quickly run through, as we had said. We have Bo Crane of Pan Disc Music, one of the architects of Miami Bass. We have Trevor Fletcher of Hit Factory Criteria Studios. And actually, the music that you were hearing playing as you came in, you may be surprised to learn that, yes, REM and some of the others that you heard actually recorded here in Miami at Hit Factory and Criteria Studios. We also have Joe Granda of Granda Entertainment. Jose Tion of MTV's TR3. Trace. And Richard Ulloa of Yesterday and Today Records, Y&T Music. Thank you so much for participating.
Ulloa.
Sorry?
It's pronounced Ulloa, but that's fine.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's Richard Ulloa.
Very good.
Thank you. Please, I will stop talking, and you guys can enjoy the panel. Thank you so much, Bruno.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here. Most of you know Miami in the 70s really came of age musically and in every other sense of the word. We're going to cover the 20 years between 1972, 73, and 1992, 93 here. After New York, in the 70s, Miami was definitely the hot spot for music, whether it was the disco sound or the recording studios in Miami. Everybody wanted to soak up the music, the sound, and the vibe in Miami. We're going to cover the 70s, then we're going to cover the 80s when Miami became this fragmented city because of everything that happened in the city politically, where we suddenly had Latin music, freestyle, the Miami Sound Machine, alternative music, gothic punk, and everything else. And then we'll lead into the late 80s, where a lot of these bands became nationally known, got recording contracts, and became pretty big stars. And, of course, into the early 90s, where the Miami bass sound, Luke Skywalker, and the Two Live Crew was born. So it's going to be a very interesting evening. We have an hour to talk. Our panelists are going to talk, and then we're going to open it for Q&A for about half an hour. But without further ado, I'd like to have every panelist introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their background and tell us how they got here and how they got involved in helping shape and making Miami what it is musically today. I'm going to start with Bo.
Good evening. Hello, can you hear me? Okay. I came to Miami to go to school at the University of Miami from New Jersey. I got my degree and decided to stay, and I'm so glad I did. I got my degree in music from the University of Miami and was going to go back to New York and make my way there, but I kind of grew up with the city. I started out as a bass player and arranger. I was the original morning man and music director at 99 Jams. Yes, I was. I was a DJ in the clubs. I had the Florida Record Pool, one of the first record pools in the country, and that kind of morphed into record promotion, record production, and I started my own label in 1982. It was called Panelists, and I had a bunch of bomb records. They were terrible records. I mean, I thought I knew what people would buy and what the radio would accept, and I had a bunch of real turkeys until I came across a record that someone had made and brought it to me that I liked. It was called The Bass That Ate Miami, and we've never looked back since then, and and that's kind of my story.
That's great. That's really good. Trevor, before we start, I'd like Esther to play three cuts of three of the best-selling albums in history that were actually recorded in Miami, and then Trevor can tell us a little bit about the Hit Factory Criteria Studios. Esther, can you play three snippets of the first three?
How can I ever change things that I feel? If I could, maybe I'd give you my word. How can I, when you won't take it from me? You can go your own way. Go your own way. You can call it another lonely day. You can go your own way.
Yes, Rumors was recorded in Miami. Rumors was part of it's actually Fleetwood Mac's biggest selling album. It's sold to date 20 million copies. The Eagles recorded Hotel California in Miami. Aretha Franklin has recorded in Miami. The Allman Brothers recorded in Miami. And this group, who are actually residents of Miami, recorded their two biggest selling albums here too. Esther? Saturday Night Fever was recorded in Miami. The Bee Gees became residents of Miami in 1975, 76, and as they were putting together Saturday Night Fever, they found that the Criteria Studios were probably the best studios in the world, according to Barry, Maurice, and Robin. So they decided to record this album here, and they followed Saturday Night Fever, an album that sold close to 24 million copies, with this other album. Trevor, I think I've set it up for you. Please tell us a little bit about you and the history of that legendary recording studio that still, to this day, hosts artists from Enrique Iglesias to Jay-Z to Janet Jackson and everybody. Please tell us a little bit more.
Thanks, Bruno. Basically, I want to make sure that I say I had no responsibility for anything to do with those albums except as a kid in high school stealing roaches out of their ashtrays. But having said that, the truth hurts. But having said that, my mother started answering phones at Criteria in 1969, 1970, and I was 5 years old at the time, and she couldn't find a babysitter, and I was in the dub room asleep when they cut Layla, and it all kind of went downhill from there. But basically, I just kind of graduated from a couple of local schools, Dade and FIU. I've got degrees in business administration and telecommunications management, which qualifies me to deliver mail. And then I was around the studio year after year after year, and it just kind of happened, and did every grunt job in the studio, from sweeping the floors to running the place basically, and went through a couple of ownerships changes. Joel Levy's in the audience tonight, and then exactly for Joel. And then in 1999, it was purchased by the Hit Factory out of New York. Spent $10-15 million, complete renovation, make it cutting edge, as good as anywhere on the planet, and spent a lot of money and still making great records. Although some of the players have changed, we've been blessed to work with a lot of the same people for decades, and we're making a lot of urban records at the moment, but before that it was disco, before that it was Hispanic stuff, before that it was rock, before that it was soul, so nothing changes but the inmates.
Joe, please tell us your story. Condensed version.
Well, I was forced to come to this country by my parents when I was 5 years old because they wanted to leave the communist regime of Cuba. And I'm very fortunate that they did. And that brought me into a totally different world because I grew up listening to the Rolling Stones and the Beatles and Santana and Journey and Styx and that type of music. But every time I would go to, it was Christmas or Thanksgiving or Grandma's birthday or whatever, I got hit with salsa, merengue, and Latin rhythms. And knowing a Cuban family, they always want you to keep the tradition going. So I heavily got into the history of Latin music without it affecting my Anglo roots of what I liked as a teenager as I grew up. So as a producer, songwriter, I began working in a club here doing events, and I did a contest and some guys won, and the whole breakdancing thing was really big. And my first final, which I don't have a copy, but I'm so lucky that the producer of the record, the co-producer is here, was a song called Rockin' It by MC Flex and the FBI crew. Some of you might remember, and became a #1 song in New York, and it was during the breakdancing era, and it became the soundtrack to the motion picture Knights of the City. And from there on, I decided to continue trying to mesh these different sounds, and I wrote and produced and created a group called Nice and Wild with a song called Diamond Girl, which is still played on radio today. So there's more going on, but we'll talk about it later.
Right, and we definitely need your insight on what happened here in the 70s with the disco scene. Jose, your background is certainly appropriate for what we're talking about. You started as a musician, and you worked as a record clerk at the record bar in Miami, and now you've risen to the ranks of Senior VP GM of MTV3. Tell us a little bit more about your start in the music industry and how vinyl was a huge part of your life and has been.
Yeah, I started playing bass after seeing the Police at Sunrise in 1980. It was the night that John Lennon got killed, actually. It was that concert that changed my life. After that, I went to school. I studied music and business, and I was working at Record Bar in Dadeland and then Record Bar at International Mall. I was a 12-inch buyer, so I bought a bunch of Nice and Wild records. They sold like hotcakes. I did 45s and 12 inches at those stores, and then after that, I graduated from school. I was playing with a band called Forget the Name, and we put out a couple of local releases. The last one that we did, actually, we recorded with Trevor at Criteria and Joe Levy. And then we toured and toured and toured, and we got nowhere, and we broke up. And after we broke up, I stayed in the music business as a manager. I managed an artist called Neil Lara, who actually recorded the record at Criteria as well. And with another artist called Pepe Alba, and a band from Tampa called Joe Pop. And after 3 or 4 years of not really making much money as an artist manager, I bumped into you at the airport, and you were telling me that you were leaving MTV, and I was on tour to Europe. And then when I came back, Bruno graciously introduced me to the folks at MTV, and I got the gig as a music programmer, as a talent guy. And from there, I went on to be the programmer, head of production for VH1 and MTV in Latin America. And as of 4 years ago, I oversee the operations for the U.S. Hispanic market for MTV Network. So I have a channel that targets bilingual, bicultural, and we try to play a good balance of music, whether it's in English or in Spanish. And that's my story. I'm sticking to it.
And you're sticking to it. It merited an applause. Rich, during the 80s and early 90s, YNT Records, Yesterday and Today Records, was Miami's version of Amoeba or Wax Track or Bleecker Bob. It was ground zero for record stores, independent record stores, where everybody hung out there, whether you were an artist or you were a fan or just a music junkie like myself. We all wanted to be there every week to buy the latest album. But you did more than just own and run a record store. You also did A&R, and you manage artists. Tell us a little bit more about what your background's all about.
You know, before I talk about myself, I wanted to recognize a couple people here. Is that okay?
That's fine.
You mentioned Joe Levy. Hey, Joel, say hello.
Yeah,
Joe Levy was the president of Criteria during a critical time in the local music scene. He did something that hasn't been done before or after. He opened up the door for the top local musicians to come in and record at a world-class facility. And quite frankly, it was like a game changer for several bands here, which ultimately led to record contests. So,
yeah.
Just want to sitting in the back is my longtime friend, John Tovar, who, John is like an institution in this town. In fact, we could spend an entire panel just talking about the bands John has worked with.
Absolutely. He wrote the book on management, and we all just, we read it every night just to know what we're doing.
In fact, a few of the bands that we talked about tonight, John discovered them, including Marilyn Manson, the Mavericks, and Nuclear Valdez. So I just wanted to recognize these two very special people there. As for me, I guess my story is pretty familiar. I was 9 years old when I saw the Beatles on TV, on the Ed Sullivan Show, and it definitely changed my life, without question. In fact, everybody used to make fun of me because I was a 9-year-old kid, a boy who loved the Beatles. So it hasn't changed. Back in 1978, I decided to do a mail order company, and for about 2 years, I used to sell collectors' records through the mail and at record shows, and that ultimately led to me opening a very small store that you first came into in 1981. My first location on Bird Road. It was like 800 square feet. It was Yesterday and Today Records. And we expanded eventually, and back when we opened the store, there was no CDs. So just nothing but vinyl. So I'm probably the transition person up here, because 17 years later, when we closed the store, pretty much there was no more vinyl. So I've seen it all, and the first involvement in the local scene with all the bands was we used to sell their records. They would come in and we would sell them on consignment, always on vinyl. And we would promote their shows with flyers and stuff like that, right? And in fact, our best-selling local record was this gentleman right here, his band called The Sleeper Breezy.
Which we're going to play.
So it wasn't until about 9 years later that I started getting involved in the local music scene, when we started hosting bands to come in, and we used to have concerts every Sunday at our store, and we used to sell tons of local bands. And around that time, John introduced me to the Mavericks, who I fell in love with, and I offered to put out their first album, and that's how I started my record label, Y&T Music, and we put out the first Mavericks CD, which led to their contract with MCA. And after that, I was hooked. That was my new passion. And we subsequently started working with Mary Carlson, and our records, we put out 2 CDs, and she signed with Atlantic. And we worked with, our third band was Four Squirrels, and we put out their first CD, and they signed with Epic. So I've kept the label going on and off since then, and we've put out like 18 different CDs, but nothing on vinyl. No vinyl. Wow. Sorry. Wow. And so I still have the label running, but it's not like a full-time thing for me. So that's what I'm doing.
Great. Well, before we get into all the local bands, because there's so much we can talk about local bands here, I want to do a brief overview of Miami in the 70s. Like I said, it was the local disco scene that Joe knows very well, how it was a thriving disco scene that actually rivaled New York in so many ways, in London and Paris. And we had all these national artists coming to record in Miami, whether they were rock, urban, R&B, whatever they were. So I want to just kind of do a quick overview with all the panelists about how they feel, how they remember the 70s in Miami musically. And we can start with Bo once again.
Well, I was, for much of the 70s, I was a club DJ. I worked in Coconut Grove mostly, at Honey for the Bears, the Mutiny, and Widow McCoy, and I also ran the Florida record pool. So this is a place where the DJs, and you know who you are out there, you used to come into our offices, and we get all the records from the labels and pass them out. So we really had an early warning system on what the hits were going to be. So we were kind of right in the middle of things, and of course, not only the national hits, but also the local hits too. So everybody locally that had a record on a 12-inch, or even before that, a 7-inch, would come in and pass the records out at our record pool meetings.
Trevor, you remember seeing the Eagles and Fleetwood Mac and Bee Gees and everybody at Criteria? Hey, Trevor?
Yeah, early on in the 70s, it was basically a lot of R&B, soul type of stuff, and then spillover from TK. The Foxy era and a bunch of the Sunshine Band guys and T-Connection and stuff like that. But as the 70s progressed, it became more rock, more mainstream pop. And then as the 70s declined, it in terms of our business, I saw a lot more disco stuff beginning as the 79, 80, something like that. So it was kind of a transition in that period. At that point, there was a lot of recreational activity fueling some of the recording. So, the import-export business was very healthy at that time, which in turn kept going a lot of nights.
You'd be driving down US 1 and you find a pack right there.
Joe, we have a picture of Foxy. As you know, Foxy was probably, after Casey and the Sunshine Band, Miami's top disco club act of the late 70s. This is before Gloria and Emilio, by the way. And Isla Ledesma was one of the most sought-after producers. Tell us a little bit more about how that local Miami disco scene, TK, Casey, Foxy, Betty Wright came of age in the 70s, please.
I lived like blocks away from the warehouse of TK Records, and TK had Henry Stone and his group of people had a lot of influence in what the Miami sound would eventually be. And I want to note somebody very special from that era that is in the audience with us tonight that I love and admire and created one of the biggest hits of the TK era, which is Timmy Thomas, which sang Like Mary Left to Ellie. That music, I think, influenced everyone who lived in Miami. And eventually it got very funky with Casey and the Sunshine Band, and then very disco with Amont. But then you could go back and listen to Betty Wright's The Cleanup Woman, James Brown. It's definitely a label that influenced the sound of Miami and the sound of soul and R&B soul. On an international level. I was heard in the UK. He did a lot of exporting, and a lot of people really made a career out of Henry Stone and TK Records.
Jose, why do you think club music from Miami or dance music from Miami has such a global appeal? We're talking about the 70s to this day. Is it because of just us being a melting pot, or just because it's just the sounds of Miami are always exotic and unique?
Well, I think that because of not because I'm Cuban, but at the beginning, the Cuban influence here, it was funky. They had like the deep bass from the salsa, the upright stuff, and you have that with like, the soul that, Miami was known for. Overtown was a big music town. And I think that was the creation. They had great rhythm sections. Those records are just solid musically, and I think that was like a breath of fresh air from other places. And then from there on, it started to graduate into more like the high energy stuff. Then we get into the Exposé sound and the Miami, then into the bass sound, Miami sound, and all that stuff. But I think that the melting pot where maybe not like in other cities that it was a little more segregated. Here, I think that people came together in the studios, and you had some really solid musicians from different backgrounds making records. So I think from a musical perspective, we were very blessed in that. And it's sweaty, it's hot, and people just want to have a good time. I think that also influenced the fact that, yeah.
That's a very good. Care to add to that, Richard?
Well, I don't know too much about the dance and the bass music as it pertains to the 70s, but I could say that after the disco phase kind of much erupted, or ended, there was a huge British influence on the local music scene. There's a lot of great bands coming out of England. I mean, just totally bands like The Clash and Susie and the Banshees and the Pistols. And it really started a whole underground scene down here in South Florida.
And that's why your store used to carry all those imports before anybody else.
It actually started a little bit before we opened. It was a year before we opened. Leslie Wimmer and Ted Gottfried opened up a totally cool, edgy store called Open Books and Records. I don't think Leslie's here tonight, but I definitely want to recognize her for what she did. And it was the first store down here to really cater to the local music scene and to the coolest imports. And there was a great scene, mostly in Broward County, but there was some bands like Charlie Pickett. There's a band called The Eat that put out a 45, and that record sells for like $800. It's so collectible. And the Cichlids, and it was a great scene, and that all basically came from the ashes of the disco music, I think, and all this great music from England. It was a great scene down there. It really started it all.
Completely agree. If you remember clubs like Fire and Ice, it was a mix of that. English, New Romantic, American disco, everything. It was just this melting pot, like Jose said.
That's right. And WVUM was really crucial, as you know.
Yes, WVUM, yes.
And building that entire thing is great.
Okay.
Is there a DJ from Fire and Ice here? I invited him. Is he here?
Wow. That would be awesome. Okay, guys, now we get on to the happy stuff. And I want to play a little bit of this next album because for better or for worse, this phenomenon put us on the global map whether we like it or not. Esther, you want to take it away? I said for better or for worse. Before we talk about the local scene here in the 80s, and we do have a lot to cover because of the local bands, I want a quick overview from our panelists as to what do they think of the Miami Vice phenomenon. Was it good in the long run? Was it bad? What are their thoughts on just everything, the TV show, the fact that it certainly put Miami in a different light. It created so many different trends. MTV started copying Miami Vice. Advertising started copying Miami Vice. And it's certainly, to this day, we're still living in a lot of ways out of that huge wave of popularity that the show gave the city. Do you want to start, Rich?
I totally agree. I think Miami Vice, the bridge between that and LeBron James and the Heat and South Beach, it's a straight line as far as I'm concerned. You know, it was a hipness factor, I think, that was cultivated with that show, and it's only grown and grown with South Beach and the models. And, I think it was great for the city. I really do.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I mean, the impact of that is basically incalculable. For the image of South Florida, I mean, yeah, there are some, minor drawbacks that somebody could point out, but I mean, the image of it being a playful destination of nightlife, of fancy people, fancy cars, from a music standpoint, from a beauty standpoint, advertisers, tourism. I mean, it really spiked billions of dollars in business in every conceivable, fashion of life, and it goes a large way to perpetuate even the whole Miami dance club, the hot Latin rhythms, the tropical stuff, and I think that the impact that made was incalculable. I restrained myself from bringing a copy of it. We recorded Don Johnson's album, The Heartbeat, at the studio. And let me tell you, it actually went gold, but then the returns came in and it went ungold. So there's an empty spot on the wall of the studio where it might be.
It's shipped gold, the return platinum. Jose?
Yeah, I mean, it put us in the map. I think that also it created an artificial aura of Miami that wasn't real at points. The fashion wasn't very respected. Looking back, you're like, wow, really, espadrilles and all that stuff. But I think it was really good for the city, and I think to this degree, to this day, we live from the fumes of of that image that show created.
Joe?
Well, I'm still wearing the V-neck and the jacket. It's not white, but...
And Bruno did a lot for Phil Collins' career too, remember?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely right. Phil Collins wrote a big, huge tour off that song, In the Air Tonight. Bo?
Well, during that era, people from up north used to call me and say, do you live like that? Do you live like that? And I go, well, yeah.
The one thing I remember about Miami Vice is it was on a Friday night, I believe at 9 or 10 p.m., and that was the only night of the week we could call anybody, and they were all staying home. They would go out after Miami Vice. It was like unheard of. People would stay home to watch TV, obviously days before DVR. But anyway, so it's certainly, to this day, like Jose said, I think we're still living on the fumes of Miami Vice, for better or for worse. It has done a lot for the city, and like Rich said, you know, the AAA and LeBron James and everybody is just, you know, spawns of what Miami Vice would have become had it still been around. Okay, we get to the interesting part now, which is the 80s, and Miami being fragmented after the disco years into this colony or sub-colony of different musical genres. We had the alternative, the gothic, the hair bands, the new romantic bands. We had everything from you name it. And I want to start talking about first one of the acts that Rich mentioned. But before we do, I'd like to play the song of The Sleep of Reason, the first song, so we can kind of use that to introduce that whole decade of all the great local scene that came out of Miami. This song from VUM. Rich, can you comment a little bit on The Sleep of Reason and the early 80s, the local scene in Miami?
Well, first of all, that record you just played was, in the entire history of our store, the top-selling record by a local band on vinyl. You know, which obviously towards the end of our store it was different, but we could not keep that record in stock. And one of the key components to that band's success, we had the club scene, the Fire and Ice, which was and had WVUM, and it seemed like the DJs would play the same things on the station and at the club, and we could not keep records in stock based on those two factors. And there was a lot of other bands in the area, but none of them had the staying power that Sleep of Reason had at that time.
Yeah, and you know, and I'm a fan, and Oscar is here, who's the lead singer of the band. And they were able to capture this on record and on stage. And I remember I was 16 years old, and I walked into Flynn's, and I saw them on stage, and they were impressive. I mean, like, you know, the hair was going, the makeup, and they looked from a real, like, great point of view, and I'm like, wow, they look like stars on stage. And this record came out, and I thought they were able to capture that essence. I mean, I remember the smell of clove cigarettes and smoke machines, and every time I play that record, it brings it up again, you know?
I think we used to sell it for like, what, $4? Yeah.
Esther, can you play the next track, please?
Love at first sight.
think this goes to your point about how the British new wave, new romantic, late 70s, early 80s music scene influenced Miami locals, Miami and the local bands. Well, Jose, you want to talk a bit about this? Because you were a big, huge fan of that whole British scene as well.
Yeah, I think that, it was a reference point for a lot of the musicians down here. In this particular case, they had a residency at a club called the Village Inn, which is in Coconut Grove, and they did 7 days a week, and they did on Monday nights, it was Apex, and it was their local night or their original night, and then the rest of the week they would play amazing versions of Talk Talk, Psychedelic Furs, all the top British and kind of like new wave bands, and they were really, really, really tight. I think that this record, if I'm not mistaken, was produced by Joe Galdo. Yeah, and actually the bass player, which is Arnold, was the bass player for Foxy, Arnold Paseiro, monster bass player, and they were.
Was the drummer for Foxy.
And Joe was the drummer for Foxy, yeah. So they had a really tight rhythm section. It's funny because I never was a fan of the band up until like 2 years ago. And I started listening to that in my iPod. I'm like, wow, I never heard that before. But they had also the whole aesthetic going, very good look on stage. And, they were, I think they represented another kind of like facet of the Miami sound.
But even if you look at the packaging, it's very, very influenced by Britain. It looks like Bauhaus or maybe something from the early Depeche Mode records or something like that.
It's like a Sire record.
Yeah, it's something out of Sire.
Yeah.
This is great. Esther, let's get on to the next song, please, and have.
This is a good song.
This is a good one.
If you can feel what I am feeling, then the truth is just believing. You're my diamond girl.
We could play the whole song, but then Joe wouldn't be able to tell us the story behind this song.
But it's really funny how I wrote this song, I swear, in about 5 minutes. The chorus repeats over and over again, and it has 2 verses. But it worked. I had always been more into groups like the Thompson Twins and ABC and Tears for Fears. I was more into that electro rock movement personally. That's why the group is nice and wild, and if you actually see them, they're dressed kind of like a gothic glam type look. But the music, back then, it wasn't called freestyle, it was called Latin hip-hop. Then it was named freestyle a little later. And people thought that it came from the black influences of music in Miami. And it actually didn't. It actually came from a group called Kraftwerk out of Germany. And Kraftwerk was picked up by the program director of the station WEDR, which is the black station in Miami that's been a leader, #1 in Arbitron rating for many years. And they picked up a song from their album called Numbers. And it said, 1, 2, 3. And it kind of like sounded like Spanish, but it wasn't. And it would have that same beat that Diamond Girl has, the doom, 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 doom. So nobody knew there were 3 white guys out of Germany, but the black station was playing that, and then that record became #1 at WEDR for I don't know how many months. They couldn't take it off. I'm sure you sold a lot of Kraftwerk albums, because I don't think there were singles out at that time. I'm sure somebody licensed it in the US and did that. And the actual influence of groups like Diamond Girl, the Pretty Tony sound with Trinier, even the Stevie B sound, which was the early Latin hip hop, later called freestyle music, came from the influence of Kraftwerk in Germany. And those of you who have never heard of Kraftwerk, Google them, look them up, listen to their shit. They're out of this world, and I'm talking about 1980s.
And they're on tour. They're on tour right now.
They're on tour right now, he says.
Yeah, they're on tour.
Outside of the Miami Sound Machine, who are probably, undisputably, the biggest selling, most important act to come out of Miami of the last 50 years. And we really can't do any justice by talking about them as part of a panel. They definitely warrant their own panel, their own hour-long special, really. But apart from giving Emilio and Gloria props for everything that they've done for the sound of Miami, for the city, for everything else, they certainly helped herald a bunch of other acts that came and followed them, one of which was Exposé, three girls from who were put together in Miami by Luis Martinet. And they for a minute, they were riding the coattails of Gloria and Emilio in the late 80s. And I'd like to ask Bo to talk a little bit more about not only Exposé, but that Miami freestyle sound, the fact that in the late 80s, Miami basically was the seed or ground zero for the Winter Music Conference, which has become now the world's largest dance music gathering every year, and it spawned the Ultra Fest and everything else. And certainly Bo was there from the ground up.
Well, I was there when they made, Exposé made their first record, and I didn't know I was going to talk about this one tonight, but anyway, I was there when the girls did the record, and they didn't do it at Criterion. Oh, they did parts of it there, okay. They put the vocals on at the other studio, Tom's studio, I can't think of it. And anyway, but it was, freestyle music was so great, but because it worked well on the dance floor and in the clubs, but it was really radio-driven, and we really had friendly radio stations in those days. Particularly Power 96, we had a couple other ones that if you had a local record, you could go and get it played on the air, particularly if you had it happening in the clubs. And this helped all of us, any genre, when you could have a record where local radio would help you get it started if they deemed it worthy. Nowadays, that's almost out the window. So Exposé started just that way. They started in the clubs, and it caught on in the clubs, and it really became like the anthem on the radio, and the rest is history. I mean, they wound up on Harrison, they had a whole bunch of hits, and Louis Martinet had a lot of gold records on his wall.
Yeah, and the production was very clean too. It was maybe superior than a lot of the dance records that were being done at the time. Also, probably be known to a lot of folks, the guitar track and the keyboard, the bass line was Fro from Nuclear Valdez and George from Nuclear Valdez. So I think that if you see the video, you guys were looking down so you couldn't see their faces or something. But I mean, it was a funky. It had a lot of groove too. And just from a sonic point of view, I remember playing at the store, and it just was a step above. It was the norm.
Would you agree that Miami led the way in freestyle, and then New York with Noel and Sweet Sensation copied Miami?
Yeah, I think so. I think that
we were the trendsetters for freestyle?
Yeah.
Well, if a record made it in Miami, it had a very good chance of making it in New York. Not every Miami record made it in New York, but many of them did, but they were started down here.
How did the winter music come about? The winter music idea of doing a winter music conference come about?
Before you jump into the Winter Music Conference, too, one of the components I think that helped create this era of music had a lot to do with the technology, in terms of the synthesizers coming of age, the ability to sample instruments, the ability to produce or create a record, but not necessarily be a musician or a multi-talented musician, multi-instrumentalist and stuff like that. So I think a lot of that democratized to some degree the ability to make music, and specifically as it appears in these genres. And if you're Louis Martinet and you put out a record, it's a lot cooler if your name isn't Martinez and you change it to Martinet. So
I think one change around that period is that most of the records in that genre were very much producer-driven. And rather than like
not just the records, the acts themselves.
Yeah, the acts and
almost
all,
replaceable components.
Yeah. They were really like a producer in the studio, and him finding people to sing and play on the record, as opposed to like original bands, beginning their career and starting their own musical vision. It was great though for what it was.
And if you analyze that era, you analyze that a lot of the kids that had the money, or daddy and mommy with the money, actually were the hit makers, because the poor kids couldn't afford those keyboards and those samplers, and that's when they became affordable. That's when that bass music and the rap that Panelists put out was able to take the lead.
Would you also say that because since we had so many nightclubs, these acts could go and hone their live performance at the clubs, whereas rock bands didn't have venues to play?
Well, not only that, they would do multiple gigs in one night. So they would do Pete and Lenny's, the Forest, and they would get into the car, and they were doing construction jobs during the day. I mean,
And they were doing roller rinks too.
yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
And so they made, they were able. Where rock bands, we never made money in clubs, really. I mean, until at least later on. But you could actually make some money doing, every weekend you would do Friday and Saturday nights, and doing 2 or 3 clubs each night. And and I think they would do the same in New York and LA.
Society.
Yeah. And Running Exotic the same way.
Exactly.
Yeah, Nice and Wild basically toured the whole world.
I was just going to
We
say, rock
went
bands,
everywhere.
local rock bands still don't make money in clubs.
Right.
But with the rock thing, you gotta have a back line. It's more expensive. You gotta carry all this equipment. It's gotta be set up. You have to do a sound check. With these groups, you press play.
Yeah, I remember that. I'm not gonna say the band, but I'm like, so what's your backup? Is like, well, this is that, and if that breaks, is the other that, and that was it.
Why do you think Miami hasn't been such a receptive breeding ground for bars and venues for rock bands and alternative bands? I mean, you guys really had to plow the soil to get gigs, and you know that very well. But it isn't like it is in Athens, Georgia, or Seattle, or Austin, or even New York City.
Well, I always blame it in we didn't have a rock radio. We had very little support. So I think Glenn had the local show on She, but we would talk to the program directors of some of the rock stations, and they just wouldn't want to take the chance. And then when they became programmed, then forget it. They wouldn't do that. I mean, there was a period there where I thought that it was gonna pop, but also Miami's more like a transient town. So there's all tourism. It's about clubs. It's about going out and dancing, and it just never caught on to at the level that other cities did. And I think it's again, a lot of people coming in and out, but the main folks that came here were to have a good time and just party at clubs, and that did well. So.
Bruno, I'm surprised that I've seen concerts at the American Airlines Arena with bands that I've never heard of, sold out for 3 days. So there is a lot of rock movement in Miami. It's just not supported on radio, and did not get the radio support for many years. Once She went out of the air, it was basically VUM, the only station which only reaches to a certain demographic.
What sometimes is missing, and when you go back to the early 90s, and Jose would remember this, you did have a scene on South Beach, and you had one club that really made a big difference, where the ownership opened it up to local bands, almost on a residency basis, like bands like Nil Lara, forget the name, Natural Causes, Mary Carlson. They basically had a room where they could build their audience. They would do a show almost every month, and as time went on, all of a sudden their shows were drawing, 100 people, 150, 200. And there were several bands down here that built an audience through this one club. And then you had Roses and Washington Square before that. So if you get the club involved who is willing to take a chance, you know, that makes a big difference. And I think that's one of the missing ingredients like today.
Not only the consumers nowadays are more so transient, but the clubs are transient. Wait 5 minutes, the name changes, there's something else on the door. Oh, it's this type of music club or what have you. And you don't have to have a stage. You've got, you know, a DJ. So you've got to build a little booth and dance floor, you know, more people in the club than seating to see a live performance or anything like that.
And the force of dance music is in Miami really began at the club level, and talking about Winter Music Conference really began with the gay club scene in Miami, which became the hottest scene all over the country, from Key West to Miami, then moved on to New York. And that gay club scene used to play high energy music at 128, 130 beats per minute, influenced very much what was happening at radio, influence what was happening as far as, you know, the dressing and the style, which is now very metrosexual. People used to dress like the gay people dressed, even though they weren't gay, because it was cool to wear these shoes or these pants or this style, and that started spreading all over the country. So the gay scene in Miami was also very, very important and influential, and actually created the Winter Music Conference. The first Winter Music Conference ever, which I was a part of and been for many years, was really all the Billboard reporting DJs that report to the Billboard dance chart, and the majority of those DJs played at gay clubs.
That's a very, very valid point. Esther, you want to play the next track, please?
Well, we're going to have a good old-fashioned square dance, so everybody get your partners, and here we go.
You want to talk a little bit about this, Bo, and tell us the phenomenon, how this became the sound in the late 80s as Miami was kind of morphing once again into the capital of Latin music, which we'll get into for a minute. But urban music suddenly became the talk of the town in Miami, something it hadn't been since the 60s, really.
Well, what happened was the sound was kind of born out of necessity. What happened was that there were a lot of black disc jockeys in Liberty City, Overtown, other black parts of the city, had these big sound systems. And they would actually do street parties and block parties and set up on the corner and actually tap into the FP&L pole, you know, and get their juice from that, and do these impromptu parties. And they would play these instrumental tracks a lot of times, the kind of electro tracks, and they would rap over them live. And people would come to me. I had my record label, I had the record pool, I had my record label, and put out a bunch of records that all bombed, and they were looking for a way to duplicate the sound that was going on at these block parties. And so finally, a guy came to me one day with this record called The Bass That Hit Miami, and at the same time, Luke Skywalker was out there, and he put out Throw the D by the Two Live Crew, and ours record store came out almost at the same time. And this Miami's Rockin' Baby was by the Megatron Crushing Crew, a made-up group by this producer who used a whole bunch of different fake names, so he put out a lot of records. And I must tell you, I got to make an acknowledgement. Virtually every record that I put out from the bass era on up till I stopped making vinyl, and probably 90% of the songs that you're going to hear tonight were mastered right here in Miami by a guy named Mike Fuller, and he's right over there. was the guy that put the bass in Miami Bass, because we would go into the recording studio, and the producers would, and the artists, and make these records and try and get a lot of bass, but until we took it to Fuller Sound at Criteria Recording Studios to get that round sound that Fuller used to do, and still does, we wouldn't have a proper bass record. And that's why, and you can tell when they put the needle down. It's right in the grooves. So, thank you, Mike.
Exactly. And as it speaks to... And that in itself is an integral chain in the production schedule of manufacturing. What we're talking about is vinyl, is having someone who has the technical knowledge as well as has mastered the art form of cutting on a lathe to manufacture vinyl. So it's not really, for those of you that aren't technically versed, it's not really, oh, I made a CD here, make it on vinyl. There's a guy who needs to take the audio and put it and get enough bass to make it sound like that without distorting or having the needle jump out. So
that was called the test pressing, and we used to take it to the club to see if it still had that 808, that thump that the actual producer created.
And you could only play like 5 times after that.
Exactly. It was, actually, I know somebody who has an acetate for one of the big Latin stars that's worth $9,000 right now in his hands. It's here in the audience.
Where were most of these local records pressed? In Hialeah?
Pressed?
Yeah.
There was a
Hialeah, Alpha.
There were about 3 or 4, well, actually, there were about a half a dozen pressing plants back in those days. But you had Miami Tape, you had Caribbean, Dick Smith, that's right, he pressed too. He did a little mastering himself. But there were about half a dozen or more. Joe Gibbs had a pressing plant. He pressed legit records in the daytime, and at night he did the bootlegs.
So, but all these resources are gone.
Exactly.
So even if you wanted to do it, it's a challenge, finding somebody to do the mastering, find somebody to do the pressing, and particularly locally.
Well, I read recently, a little different, I read recently that the sale of vinyl has massively gone up compared to the past 10 years. I mean, we sold on independent 80,000 12 inches of diamond grow, and then Atlantic took it over and sold another 200,000. Not to that level, but I heard that there is a lot of vinyl being sold again.
Oh, no, it's very fashionable. There's definitely a resurgence. It's a very niche market, but to dramatically increase, if you sell 10 units and then you sell 100 units, it's still not very much, but it's dramatically increased, yeah.
I think also the whole process back in the day, and I don't want to sound like an old fart, but it was more of an in-depth process, and you had to be more serious about it. From recording prior to Pro Tools, there's no time alignment, no pitch correction, to the laying out the artwork. It was an art form. It isn't like in a computer where it was more of a artiste process that I think that because now it's so easy to make a record, you forget or you don't put as much love or input into the whole enchilada.
I would say your wife Melanie put it best when she said a lot of people today, when they make a record, they assemble it.
Right.
As opposed to like when you made records in the old days, it was more of a craft.
It was more a collaborative effort.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really changed. I mean, the whole Pro Tools pros and cons is a whole other panel discussion. I'd love to see that.
Yeah, absolutely. Esther, can we jump and play Nuclear Valdez? And the reason why I want to jump and play Nuclear Valdez, guys, because Nuclear Valdez, as John Tovar can probably correct me if I'm wrong, was the first local rock, alternative rock band to sign to a major label. This happened in 1989. They signed to Epic Records, part of Sony Music. This was huge for Miami because apart from Miami Sound Machine and these acts that we've been talking about, a band that could write and produce themselves had not been signed to a major label. It meant that the major record companies, the 6 major record companies in New York, finally realized there was talent in Miami apart from the dance, disco, freestyle freestyle scene. So their importance is so humongous to this period, the late 80s, 90s, and even now. I mean, you really want to think about Nuclear Valdez being the first Latin rock band, if you will. You see Maná now, and they take so much from Nuclear Valdez. You see these bands throughout the world, and Nuclear Valdez have influenced everybody from Robbie Rosa to you name it. So their influence is just tremendous, and it's just, we can't overstate how important this band was to the city.
We should play another track of the remix. It's not, I think from the other side. Yeah, it's inside B. Sounds good inside B. Yeah.
That was a hit. That was a hit.
Yeah, Summer was a hit. MTV got behind them. They were like, I think, the third or fourth band to do an unplug with MTV.
This video, like Jose said, was on power rotation on MTV for many, many weeks. First Miami rock band to achieve that on MTV, and like I said, global success. It wasn't just Miami, regional, national. They played sold-out tours in Europe, Scandinavia, Japan, Southern Europe, and everything else. So we have to certainly talk about the importance of Nuclear Valdez because they opened the door to other bands that followed in the early 90s.
Yeah, I mean, production of the I love, I mean, we're friends, but I had huge respect for them. I think this record also, the production was really great because it captured who they were and embellished it without losing the essence of you know, what they're all about. Great songs. I mean, George is an amazing guitar player. The lyrics outstanding about, you know, very deep topics. This one is particular about the exodus of Cubans, you know, after leaving the island, after Fidel. So I think it was the whole package. I think, you know, I still listen to the records, to both records. I think it was definitely something that Miami should be very proud of. Yeah.
Yeah, and Fro, are you here, by the way, still?
Yes, he is.
Where are you, Fro? No? Anyway, Fro, I saw him here earlier today. He wrote that great song. And he has, one of the things that made Nuclear Valdez so unique is Fro's signature vocal style. You know, very unique. When you hear his voice, you know it's him. He doesn't sound like anybody else. And the record had an honest feel to it in terms of its production and mastering everything. It's a record that we're all very proud to be part of this scene.
And what was beautiful about that time is that I was playing with my band at the time, we all wanted them to succeed. It was kind of like everybody was behind them because it meant that much to the local scene. So there was a really good kind of like a
camaraderie.
Yeah, about all the local musicians, because they were, you know, paving the way to hopefully more of us to go after that.
Bruno, I remember the day the record came out. The guys in the band had not seen the record, and they came by the store, and we had a big display. I think maybe you set it up, and they were so excited to see the record on vinyl for the first day. I'll never forget it. It's great.
Nothing beats the vinyl experience, by the way, of just opening a record and just taking the sleeve and watching.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Tuesdays was the day, right?
Tuesday was the day, exactly. Tuesday's release day, Tuesday.
Yeah.
It still is to this day. One of the great things about Nuclear Valdez, apart from their talent and the fact that they gave Miami this different light musically, is that they attracted a lot of A&R people. These are the people who are in charge of signing artists from the record companies to come to Miami and find talent. Suddenly Miami became this hot spot for every single A&R person from Columbia, Warner, Arista, Atlantic, Universal, you name it, they were all coming down to look for the next big thing. And one of those big things happened to be a Cuban country band called the Mavericks. Do you have the song, or should we talk about it first? Let's play a little bit of the Mavericks, and then our panel can talk about this.
You left me once, you left me twice. I know someday you'll realize the things you broke don't have a price, but you will never know. I never thought you'd be the one to leave me here with my soul undone. I never asked for what I do want, but you will never know. No one can feel the tears that I cry tonight. I see the scars.
This sounds like a punchline of a joke, a Cuban country band from Miami, but you guys can talk about this. I mean, this band sold millions and millions of records, and they were, the country music market is very closed to outsiders, especially if you're Cuban or Latin or whatever you are. But these guys managed to penetrate Nashville, and they were one of the most critically and commercially successful bands in Nashville to the late 80s, early 90s.
I think a lot of people are mistaken about Cubans and country music. When I was really small and there was a lot of local TV in Miami, I remember my mom playing some, shows, like music shows, and there's a style of music from Cuba called punto guajiro. El guajiro is the country guy from the country. And what they used to do is they used to play this kind of ad-lib guitar, which was very country-like, and they used to ad-lib on a subject like if it was a rap. And they used to talk on a subject, let's say they're talking about somebody else's wife, well, she left with the other guy, and the other guy did this, and they actually did it in rhythm and rhyme and poetry with melody. And there's nothing like country music like that. It was incredible.
But this country music is, before the Mavericks, Raul was a singer, and he's an amazing vocalist. He used to play in a band called the Tomboys, and they used to do a lot of private events, and they were like, the private schools, a lot of covers, Beatles, very big into the Beatles. And he used to work with me and I think maybe John at Peaches. And they broke up, and then him and a guitar player called Ben Peeler, who went on to play with Shakira, and a big rock band from the... the Wallflowers. He played with the Wallflowers. They start playing, and they're called the Mavericks, and they're playing country. Like, are you fucking kidding me? I was like, no, man. And I went to see them, and he had great pipes, great writing chops. And then from there, they got the band together, and they became, what they became. But Raul is a monster vocalist. I mean, like...
when the Mavericks started, they didn't have a full band, and it was Robert and Fro from Nuclear Valdez that did their initial demos and played their first few shows, absolutely. And John actually worked for me at my record store when he started managing the Mavericks, and one day he comes up to me and says, "Rich, I want you to hear this band," and he plays this demo, and he didn't tell me anything about the band. He played this demo of a couple songs. I said, "This is great. Who is it?" And he goes, "It's the new band I'm managing, the Mavericks." And he gave me a little background, and I went out to see them at Churchill's, and they were great. And they did some covers, like they did some Police songs, and I remember they used to do Lucille. But they did, but they had some originals, and they totally blew me away, and I became an instant fan. And over the course of the summer, I used to go out to see every single show, always, any weekend I could. And one day, I remember sitting with John and his manager, his partner at the time, Frank, talking about, I think we should do an independent record. I think the time is right. And I had never made a record on my label before. I didn't have a label, it was just a record store. So eventually Raul and John agreed to do it, and they went into the studio. They spent like 5 weeks. They blocked out a little 16-track studio called Tropical Recording Studios off of Bird Road. They had the studio for 6 weeks. I knew the owner, he was a friend of mine. And they made an amazing record. You know, they had a great production. And we put the record out in January, and within 2 months, it was the first record I ever put out, and I didn't know anything about how to promote a record. I just went on my instincts. I did my homework. I did my research. Found out who are the important people to send it to. And it must have been, we got a review in Billboard and Hits and some other magazines. And the record came out in January, and I think it was by March or April, Warner Brothers had offered them a record deal. It was just like that. And they eventually signed with MCA.
MCA, yeah.
So it was a really great story. It changed my life because, you know, it was the first record I ever did, and since then, that's all I really wanted to ever do is make records.
Fantastic. And at that same time, I remember Miami was competing with well, Seattle hadn't come up to the scene nationally yet, but it was still Athens, Georgia. But between Nuclear Valdez, Mavericks, and then you suddenly had this weird guy called Marilyn Manson, and then this hair band called Saigon Kick. So suddenly we became this tremendous melting pot for all these different genres of music that were all getting signed nationally, right?
Yeah. They, Manson was all of a sudden became. They were touring the state of Florida. They were drawing people in Tampa and Orlando, and all of a sudden, folks started paying attention to them. Trent Reznor. I remember I was at a show in Hollywood when Trent came down, and he was sitting next to John and watching the whole stage going crazy. And then he signed to Nothing Records, and then became the Manson that back then it was Marilyn Manson and the Spooky Kids, and they would walk around with their lunch boxes full of stuff.
Yeah, I'll never forget. I was at the Button South to see the Mansons, and I couldn't believe it. There was like 100 little girls there with lunch pails, and waited in the audience, and it was at that moment that I knew there was something going on.
Yeah.
And John was there that night, and he had an A&R rep from Epic Records come to that show, and her name was Marnie, and Marnie went nuts for the band, and you remember her, don't you?
I went to school with her.
So
she was my first kiss.
Wow. Yeah, they know that.
It was bad because she's gay now, so I don't know what happened.
So Marnie, she made it her mission in life to get this band signed to Epic. She went through all kinds of hoops, finally got the New York people involved, and they flew the band up to New York with John and his partner to play a little private showcase in this little warehouse. I think it was SIR Studios. I wasn't there, but I heard the story. And they showcased for about 20 executives, and at the end of the show, the label passed on it. And I'm sure John could tell us the whole story one day, but it wasn't for another year that they really signed to Nothing Records. So it goes to show everybody gets passed on all the time.
The Beatles did.
Yeah, every great story, there's always a rejection somewhere.
Yeah, you too were rejected by Sony, CBS Sony, a couple of times. So I wonder who was the person who said no to them. From the Mavericks, we have another artist who, Rich, you were very influential in shaping her career. Singer-songwriter, Mary Carlson. That's another thing we really didn't think Miami would have that kind of an artist here. You think of a singer-songwriter, you think, once again, Midwest or Northeast or, Seattle, Northwest, whatever, not Miami. But Esther, can you play a little bit of Mary Carlson and have Rich comment on it? And we're going to wind it up in about 5 minutes.
First of all, I want to say that there's an MTV executive playing bass on that track.
Oh, man.
And Fro's playing guitar on the track, and he's back there. With Mary, once again, my good friend John Tovar introduced me to this artist. She was in a band called Vesper Sparrow, and John brought me a cassette and put it in the store, and I liked it, and I went to see the band at the Village Inn on a Monday night, and I totally fell in love with the bass player when she sang the songs. And
Oh, she was a bass player.
she was a bass player in the Vesper Sparrow, and she would sing like 2 or 3 songs every set. So when she started singing, it was like, wow, this girl's special. And when she left the band in 1990, John gave me a demo tape of hers, like 3 songs, and I just flipped, and I knew I just put out the Mavericks record, and instantly I knew that I wanted Mary to be my next project to work with. So I wrote her this like 5-page letter, and she thought I was crazy. She thought I was stalking her or something. I said, we should make a record. I think it'd be great. And eventually she came around to it, and we put out our first record. The Mavericks helped me. They were in the studio, they recorded it, and it took a while. It took us about 1.5 years. It took us 2 CDs to really build her career. And we did a low-budget video. A friend of mine, Mark Gray, directed it, and we sent it to CMT and the Nashville Network, and you know what? They played it. We couldn't believe it. I got a call that they put in rotation, and we did a follow-up video that got added to VH1 Country, CMT and TNN, and for an unsigned artist on a tiny little label, that was a real big feat to be on VH1, and that's when Atlantic called and offered us a record contract. So Mary signed with Atlantic. She put out 1 record on Atlantic.
It shows the diversity of the talent pool of Miami, that we could have a singer-songwriter, like I said, who we at first thought and first listen you would think is probably from the Midwest. And she's actually from here, or developed her chops here. And we have Nicola Valdez and Marilyn Manson, Saigon Kicks, and then we have all the freestyle bands. And you think about, really, we are truly a melting pot. I've heard and I've read in many magazines that Miami represents demographically what America will be in 50 years, that we really are truly the future in America in so many ways, just because we really are the definition of a melting pot. And I think musically that's been good for us. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to play one more track and just touch a little bit on Latin music, because we can't, forget that Latin music, not only, like Jose says, has been here from the last 40, 50 years, but to this day is really one of the main driving factors of Miami's music scene. Can we play DJ Laz and kind of intro? DJ Laz was a DJ at Power 96 up until a couple of weeks ago. One of the most important and influential DJs from Miami. One of the first DJs to start sprinkling Latin sounds, Latin music on what we call top 40 crossover urban radio. In a lot of ways, a lot of the Latin producers nowadays are borrowing a page from what DJ Laz has been doing for the last 20 years, and it goes without saying that Latin music just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and Miami is for Latin music what Nashville is for country music, or what New York is for pop and rock, really, if you will.
Back to the left, now back to the right. Lazarus got this party hype. When it comes to work, you know who's boss. Dang, he's here to set it off.
This is one of the best cases or best examples of Latin sounds, Spanish language music, melting with what we call general market Anglo-American sounds. And this is exactly what artists like Jennifer Lopez are doing today, what artists like Shakira, Ricky, and Enrique have been doing for the last couple of years. But Bo, you were the person responsible for many of these songs with DJ Laz. Tell us a little bit about this and about how Latin music's role in Miami has not only developed but exploded.
Laz was a DJ on Power 96, but he was one of like 6 or 7 mixers at the station. So he would come in and do a little mix show. And he was very young at the time. He was like, I want to say 16 years, 17 years old, something like that. And I heard him on the mix show, but Cito Llerena, who was running the record pool for me at the time, said, you got to have this guy come in. He's got an idea for a record. So Laz came in and told me the idea for the record. He didn't have a demo or anything. He kind of demonstrated. And the record itself is a combination of an old Wilfredo Vargas song called El Africano. At the beginning, we had a thing, you didn't hear it, but Alvaro Guedes, the Cuban comedian, does a thing it's all a crazy mixed up thing with a bass beat, and we got Danny D to do some rapping, and he kind of put it all together and mixed it, and it's so typical of what Miami is. A little bit of this, a little bit of that, a big heavy bottom, and you can dance to it, and we had a hit, we had a monster. And we did like 8 albums together, so we had a bunch of hits.
And he's also one of the pioneers of radio, of promoting acts here too. I mean, DJ Laz is one of the top DJs we've had in the city for the last 20 years.
Yeah. Now in semi-retirement, I think.
Semi-retirement.
He'll be back.
Great, Trevor. During the '90s, you guys had a lot of course, the urban acts, the hip hop acts, the ones who had, as the record company started shrinking recording budgets, and recording became a lot of an easier affair, and a lot of artists started recording albums at homes. Recording studios like Criteria started shrinking their traffic, if you will. But in the '90s, hip hop was still humongously generating revenue formats, and you had Jay-Z, you had Janet Jackson, you had Missy Elliott, you had Timbaland, you had everybody parked at Criteria for months and months during the '90s as well.
Well, it became strange to me to think that really with the advent of all the technological advantages in terms of making music, the one style of music that could legitimately be made in your bedroom in boxer shorts was the one style of music that had the budget to come to a ridiculously expensive studio. So I don't know where the dichotomy of that is, but I mean the facility was based on creating an atmosphere that was conducive to creativity, making people comfortable, making people provide a collaborative atmosphere, or what have you, with people that would come into the studio and create. And in my mind, the only explanation I have is that there's something about going to a place that makes you feel special, that makes you feel creative, that makes you feel empowered to perform at the top of your game, regardless of the technology. That is why studios like that continue to make quality recordings to huge records and things of that nature. And there's something people always ask me, why would I go to a studio when I can make this record at home? The same reason that when you're a performer and you step on stage, there's a level of adrenaline, there's a level of something in your head that says, it's showtime, I have to perform. It's not the same if you stumble from your bedroom to the den and the dog runs by and you grab a sandwich and you're watching TV and it can take you all night to do something. It's something different when there's highly trained professionals, the best equipment in the world, all sitting around waiting at your beck and call to capture a magical performance. Something says, okay, I need to perform, that you don't get when you go home. So I think that's one of the primary reasons why our business changed to some degree, but in order to maintain a business, it's a very expensive place, a staff of 27 people or what have you, you need to just cater to what your recording artist, whether it's an urban artist, whether it's a Ricky, whether it's a Latin band, whether it's a hip hop project, whatever it is that they need to elicit the magical performance, that's what we try and provide. So it's an interesting beast, but it continues to evolve, and we have to determine, what it is to have Nuclear Valdez come in and record, or the Mavericks come in and record, or forget the name or whatever, but to make all of them feel special and to, dedicate, our sense of purpose to providing that.
And I have a vivid picture of when we were recording at Criteria. I think we were in Studio C and we were doing guitars, and then in Studio A was REM doing Automatic for the People, and then I think in Studio B it was Julio Iglesias. Yeah. And at one point I think everybody came into the parking lot like, holy shit, what's this? It was like bizarre Twilight Zone, but that was kind of like the scope of the reach of that studio. And I mean, it made you say, man, James Brown, the Eagles, everybody has been in this room, and I don't know, there's a spirituality to it that it's great.
And not to get on the soapbox, but I'll go one step further. with the advent of all the technology enabling people to make records at their houses or whatever, that's great, I respect that. Pro Tools, digital audio workstations were designed to be a tool in the creation of your musical vision, not a crutch to create your musical vision. But that aside, one of the byproducts of that is studios of all levels going out of business, closing. In New York and Manhattan, it used to be a studio on every corner. Now there's like 3. It's ridiculous. It's a very expensive business to run. But a lot of these magical landmark recordings that were developed out of the sense of people coming together, collaborating. Julio bumping into Judas Priest in the parking lot, or forget the name and whatever. So, but that atmosphere of meeting professionals, exchanging ideas, creative juices, or what have you, is a dying thing because the places that used to occur are ceasing to exist.
Yeah, and I can vouch for that. When I was in the studio with Ricky a couple years ago, and next door Jay-Z was working with Ludacris. Ludacris came in and did some stuff, and that kind of meeting point, if you will, does not exist when you record at your own house or your own studio. It's really magical. We're going to wrap it up. One last question to all the panelists, and then we wrap it up, and you can ask them questions outside at the reception. I want all of you to tell me, as Joe said, there's a resurgence of vinyl sales. Obviously, year-to-date vinyl has, I think sales have increased 9%, which is still minuscule compared to the overall pie of music sales, if you will. But there's this interest in vinyl again, from young people, from older people, from everybody. And I'd like each panelist to give us a quick answer as to why they think the reason is there's this interest in vinyl once again. And with that, we'll wrap it up, and we'll take it outside and be open for questions and answers over there. Bo, do you want to start?
It sounds better. Believe me, it sounds better. Always has, and it always will.
Good answer.
My take on it is it's everything that's old is new again. It's cyclical, and it does sound better, but it's something tangible you can hold in your hand. You pull it out of the sleeve, you read the sleeve, you touch it. It's an event. I mean, I can't remember anybody that said, from 20 years ago, oh, it's Tuesday, my favorite band is just coming out, I'm going to go to this record store, I'm going to buy an album or whatever. Somebody just said, oh, it's Tuesday, let me download my favorite song or my favorite artist from iTunes. It's a different dynamic. It's something tangible.
Joe?
Hip-hop, rap is selling in vinyl like crazy, and a lot of the DJs make it, they can manipulate the vinyl a lot different, no matter how many machines they've created for CD for you to scratch and play with. It's not the same craft. So once you learn the craft of doing it on vinyl, you want to have the music on vinyl.
Yeah. I think it's become once again like an art piece, and from the kid that likes the vinyl release of the newest, coolest band to the old, guy that has a $40,000 stereo, and I think those are like the two aspects that are buying the vinyl today. It's an art form from the way you hold it, to the way you open it, to the way you play it, and also to the way you listen to it. You put it in and you listen to the record as it was meant to listen. You can't skip it, and I think that in itself, it's something to be respected.
Very good.
I think all of the reasons that you all touched on are contributing to the resurgence. I do think, though, that there's a ceiling. I don't think it's like going to come back in like a mass quantity where it's like affecting sales charts and stuff. But I think that there's an indie cred factor for